Hello and welcome. For those just joining us, this is a series of videos in which I attempt to completely destroy the arguments in A Conscious Universe by Almando Calvo. My mission is to engage in dialogue, have a respectful debate, and possibly win a $50 gift card. In my earlier videos, we've talked about brains, morality, trees, DNA, Bigfoot, aliens, and more. We're now on Chapter 4, Live, Laugh, Love. Mr. Calvo explains he chose the title because
we have all heard this beautiful saying. Many people have this saying printed and framed. Others have this quote in stickers that they had applied to their walls. These are positive things that we all want to look at and live by.
The chapter is appropriately divided into three main sections, but I will have the most to say about the live section. Afterward, I'll make just a few comments about laugh and love. The live section turns out to be another argument about the basis for morality.
Life is a beautiful thing. We all have this urge to live, and we all have this desire to be happy. Now, why would these things matter in a world that was not set up to have specific goals and directions? Is it because we know that whatever makes a person happy means that it's lawful? What if rape or murder makes someone happy?
So no one ever said that the standard for morality is whatever makes an individual happy. Think about what you just said. We all have the urge to live. We all desire to be happy. So when someone takes an action that has the effect of harming others, that individual may feel some enjoyment, but the overall happiness of the group goes down because someone's been harmed. And not just the victim, but the whole society is harmed, because once you start to allow murder, nobody knows who the next victim is going to be. Nobody's safe. So everyone is less happy. To have a feeling of safety in the community, safety for your family, and the freedom to live your life without fear, all important parts of happiness, you have to prohibit acts of violence. Calvo goes on.
Think about the Holocaust. All those men, women, and children who lost their lives due to Hitler's dictatorship. Was that lawful because, according to the historical data, Hitler was unrepentant, remorseless, and brazen? His power and authority made him prideful and happy with his results of victory over the weak and poor.
No, it wasn't lawful because it caused unimaginable pain and suffering and terror and grief for millions of people. I understand you're saying those things are only bad because God says they're bad. So if there's no God, there's no basis to call them bad. Let's take this one step at a time. When pain and suffering happen to us, we know it's bad. It doesn't have to be evil in the theological sense. We don't need to justify it with some metaphysical principle. It's bad in the most basic sense of the word. It feels bad. It hurts. We know this on an animal level. Animals don't want to be hurt or killed, and neither do we. And then we have something called empathy, which allows us to virtually experience the pain of others. When a member of our family or a member of our community is hurt, we feel an emotional pain that tells us this is bad, just as if it were happening to us. Next, because we have analytical minds, we as human beings look at the situation and say, no, one person doesn't get to inflict misery on millions because overall it makes the world more dangerous and frightening and miserable. Calvo continues.
Was Hitler objectively wrong, or was his compass of life leading him in a direction of absolute happiness and security that would ultimately not be objectively wrong according to the absence of objective morality? Well, I most certainly beg the difference. What Hitler did was absolutely, without a doubt, evil.
So I think a system of morality based on compassion and empathy is objective in the sense that human suffering is measurable, and you can use data to assess which actions promote happiness and minimize suffering. You can literally do the math. If you're looking for an objective standard, there it is. Of course, you'll still have some disagreements. That's true no matter what you consider the basis for morality. But as long as we agree on the goal of promoting happiness and reducing harm, we can have a conversation about the best way to do that. The difficult question is, what if someone doesn't agree with the goal? We can show that a world of love and freedom and justice is objectively better because it contains more of the good things we cherish and less of the suffering we hate. But if someone says, I don't care, I choose hate, I prefer to inflict misery, the question is, by what authority do we say that person is wrong and needs to stop? What makes moral pronouncements binding so that every individual is bound to follow them? To illustrate the point, let's look at how Mr. Calvo's side might answer this question. I can think of at least 3 ways the existence of God is supposed to help with this problem. First, absolute goodness. On this view, besides being a person, God is something like a Platonic form of goodness. The fact that things are right or wrong is baked into the nature of reality, like the truths of mathematics. Next, divine sovereignty. As the author of the universe, God has the ultimate authority to give us commands. He's our maker, he's our owner, he's the boss. We're supposed to do what he says because he's God. Finally, heaven and hell. You obey God, you go to heaven. Otherwise, you go to hell. This is somewhat complicated by the Christian doctrine that we're all bad and condemned to hell, and we're only saved by belief in Jesus, but let's set that aside for now. On some level, trying to obey God has something to do with heavenly rewards, and disobeying him leads to some type of punishment. The so-called Euthyphro dilemma is based on trying to figure out the relationship between the first 2 of these things. Does God command certain things because they're good, or are they good because he commands them? I think a theologian would say these are not 2 different things. They're different aspects of the same thing. Regardless, I'm going to analyze each point separately. I don't find the absolute goodness argument compelling because I don't think it explains anything. We wanted to know why certain things are good or evil, and this argument basically says, because the ultimate eternal nature of reality is that certain things are good or evil. I don't really know what that means, and it feels like circular reasoning. Good and evil exist because they just do, because God. And the other 2 arguments are even worse. Divine sovereignty fails because it would equally compel us to obey an evil God. If we had been created by a God who promotes murder and slavery and torture, would it be right for us to do these things because God said so? The Bible's answer to this question is essentially yes. In Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to kill his son Isaac, and Abraham is prepared to do it. God reveals at the last minute that it was only a test, and that Abraham doesn't actually have to kill his son, but he passed the test by showing he was willing to. It would comport better with my understanding of morality if that was the way to fail the test. Abraham would have shown himself to be more morally developed and more loyal to what God is really supposed to represent if he had stood up to Yahweh and said, "No, I refuse to commit this barbaric act." Command-based morality is ultimately not a moral system. Truly moral decision-making is about following the dictates of your conscience, not obeying authority. Fanatical, cult-like obedience to an authority figure is what made Nazi Germany possible. When voices in the night start telling you to murder children, the moral, ethical thing to do is refuse, whether the person giving you orders is God or Hitler. And rewards and punishments are by far the worst, least moral reason for doing anything. This reduces God's universe to a sort of extortion racket, where you gotta do what the boss says or else he'll break your legs. Not only that, but God letting sinners burn in hell for all eternity is problematic in itself. I don't know how you can talk about being kind and loving and then believe in a God who condemns people to infinite suffering and torture. Surely the wickedest and least moral doctrine ever imagined. It's especially hypocritical if you're the type of Christian who thinks all unbelievers go to hell. You'd be blaming Hitler for putting Jews in ovens, and just a moment later praising God for casting the same Jews into an eternal lake of fire. So if we reject these 3 theistic explanations, how can we explain on naturalistic grounds why we should be moral? I can think of 3 ways to think about this. One is that empathy is a part of wellness. For the mentally healthy, well-adjusted person, there's a feeling of moral revulsion attached to the thought of harming fellow creatures. Of course, people also take pleasure in doing harm, but I would argue that this is a less enduring, less satisfying type of pleasure. A life of conflict and hate leads to more anxiety, more guilt. I believe that good, decent, ethical behavior, loving your neighbor like you love yourself, leads to a deeper, more secure happiness, something like inner peace. I'm aware that this might sound like a religious conviction. This is something like what was preached by Confucius, Lao Tzu, Buddha, and Jesus. But the point is, I don't think you need a metaphysical justification or a supernatural enforcer to get there. I think empathy is embedded in human nature, so that harmony with our fellow creatures is a natural source of joy. Certain people may be missing this capacity for empathy. We call them sociopaths or psychopaths. But we recognize that this is a disturbance. We know what a healthy, morally developed person looks like. We look at the kid who tortures puppies or bullies all the kids in the neighborhood, and we know he's not okay. Something's not right. On this view, bad behavior is wrong, not in the sense of Jimmy got 2 questions wrong on the math test, but wrong as in, what's wrong with you? Next, there is what philosophers call enlightened self-interest. Apart from any good feelings you get from making people feel good, there are practical benefits to being cooperative. Again, you might benefit in the short run from stealing or cheating or lying, but eventually such behavior is likely to poison your personal relationships. Not only do you risk your own inner peace, you risk any chance of having secure, trusting, mutually beneficial relations with other people. Finally, there's the so-called social contract. This is similar to the point about personal relationships, but on a broader level. We live in a society, and in exchange for society's protection, we tacitly agree to a sort of truce or peace treaty with all our fellow citizens. We don't want to be harmed, so we've signed on to this deal that we won't harm other people and they won't harm us. And it's in our interest to support this system, not only by behaving ethically, but also by spreading the word, expressing our support. To be clear, I'm not using the word society to mean the same as government. If the government can help enforce some of these rules, great, but I wouldn't rely on that. I'm talking about the actual community of neighbors and fellow citizens, which exists separate and apart from any government. Of the 3 points, this last one is the weakest because society itself can have moral blind spots. You get whole societies that support slavery or racial, ethnic, and religious persecution. Sometimes brave individuals have to stand up or the world has to band together to abolish slavery or stop Hitler. You could argue that in this case, Hitler's Germany existed within a bigger society that ultimately rejected his hateful ideology. But we can't always depend on allies swooping in to save the day. Sometimes society drops the ball. And in the end, we have to follow our own moral judgments based on empathy and compassion. Still, societies are generally set up to prevent random violence and mayhem. We can depend on society to accomplish this, at least, and fight to keep making our society more decent and more just. So one thing we can do is put these 2 models side by side and see what we think is a better system. And let's note that by no means do these 2 models exhaust the possibilities. We haven't considered a mystical law of karma that rewards good behavior and punishes evil. Karma is often associated with a system where more enlightened souls get reincarnated as higher and higher beings until they get to the top of the ladder and achieve nirvana. I won't examine this concept in detail, but let it suffice to say that if you don't buy the naturalistic model, you don't automatically get kicked over to the God hypothesis. I think it's fair to say that both of these models have pros and cons. I've already given my critique of the theistic model. As for the naturalistic model, I can understand someone feeling that it lacks that bold, authoritative, voice of God quality. Some vague promises about inner peace and the joy of friendship and getting along with people and fitting into society except when society is wrong. That doesn't say thou shalt in the same booming voice that God does. But let's note that at this point, we're not talking about what's true. We're talking about what feels more satisfying, or even which one's a better strategy. If you're trying to get people to comply, is it better to talk about empathy and compassion and building a better world? Or is it better to talk about heaven and hell and divine commandments? Even if I concede that you've got a better story, it's got more drama, better characters, stronger imagery, that doesn't do anything to prove that it's true. And in fact, it might be a reason to suspect that it isn't true. Isn't it a bit too convenient that we as a society want people to act a certain way, and there just happens to be an almighty invisible person who also wants them to act that way? Isn't it clear why, whether or not there's a God, we would be motivated to create one? The human imagination wasn't satisfied with all this talk about compassion and empathy. We needed a story about it. So every culture came up with a myth to explain good and evil. Pandora's box, the serpent. We weren't satisfied with our natural ways of enforcing the moral law, so we dreamed of karma, vengeful ghosts, furies, gods of vengeance, angels and demons, heaven and hell. If the naturalistic basis of morality feels inadequate, that doesn't prove God exists. At most, it proves why we might want a God. But God won't exist just because we want him to. The last thing I'll say about this is that apologists sometimes talk about Hitler as if Christian morality were some kind of safeguard against persecution and hate. They seem to be forgetting the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, 1,000 years of Jews being persecuted by Christians. Are we supposed to forget centuries of persecution because it wasn't executed with the brutal efficiency of the Nazis? To speak frankly, the Christian movement has no credibility on this issue. This is not trash talk. I don't blame individual Christians for the bad behavior of Christians in the past, but if apologists are suggesting that Christianity has a good track record in this area, no, it very doesn't. That's it for the live section, and I'm hoping that's all I'll have to say about morality for the rest of this series. If Mr. Calvo wants to make the moral argument again, I will just refer him to this video, rather than repeating my points in future videos. In a way, the sections on laughing and loving make an argument similar to the one we just discussed. Just like Mr. Calvo wants a transcendent metaphysical basis for morality, he wants the same sort of thing for love and laughter. On love, he says,
according to the atheistic worldview, love is nothing more than a chemical balance within a person due to the process of cellular mutation. If that is true, then love is nothing more than a chemical. Ultimately, every person whom you believe to love is only loved due to your chemical reaction. What if you wake up and you no longer have the chemical of love available?
And on laughter.
How could something as funny as a joke be comprehensible in a mind wired to control all aspects of human functionality? How could something be considered funny if all reactions are only a byproduct of chemical reactions? Your body is randomly reacting, making whatever caused you to react not necessarily funny per se, but the vibrations of chemical activity.
This is all very strange. Mr. Calvo is determined to say that all our experiences are less meaningful and less authentic if the way they happen is via chemicals in the brain. But you don't invalidate something by saying what it's made of. Food is good because it nourishes us. You don't say, this food seems like nourishment, but it's just an illusion because it's all made of chemical elements. Or, this seems like a house, but it's just an arrangement of wood and plaster and aluminum siding. If it serves as shelter, it's a house. The value of a thing is not found in its physical components. It's an emergent property based on what the thing can do for us. Why would being caused by chemicals make an experience less genuine and important? If instead, love and laughter and beauty and art are caused by spirits, why is that better? Couldn't you just as easily say, oh, those things don't matter, they're just caused by spirits? It's like you don't feel justification to care about your own feelings unless God says they're important. You feel like you need God to validate your experience, because if it didn't come from some metaphysical transcendent source, then it's just brain chemistry. But your experience is a real experience because you experienced it. Whether you're a ghost in a machine, a clump of cells, or a brain in a jar. It doesn't matter what's happening in some immaterial spirit realm. Feelings exist because we feel them. That's enough. Your argument made a little more sense when we were talking about morality. Because for morality to work, we need everybody to be on board. If right and wrong are totally subjective, there's potentially a problem. But what's wrong with the notion that humor is subjective, or that love is? There's an expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I think that's exactly right. These are feelings that we have, and they have a lot to do with our instincts and our moods and our hormones and our brains. I'll admit, I felt some sympathy when Mr. Calvo expressed concern that the person you love is only loved due to your chemical reaction. What if you wake up and you no longer have the chemical of love available? I mean, yeah, that's really tough. And let's be honest, this happens sometimes in life. That's true whether love is caused by chemicals in your brain or handed down from God. Sometimes you feel like you really love a person or they really love you, and then the day comes when that feeling is gone. Nobody wants that. We all live in hope that the next relationship will work, that our love will last. But this is not an atheist problem or a theist problem. This is a human problem. And you can't wish it away by asserting that love comes from some magical spirit realm. And then, just when I was feeling some sympathy for Mr. Calvo, he comes up with this.
And no, love is not love. That does not make any sense and it is inconsistent. Life is to be acted upon responsibly and morally. Marriage of a man and woman, not two men or two women.
And then he goes on to equate such relationships with pedophilia. First, I want to point out that there is no context for this. He doesn't start by saying, one often hears the proponents of same-sex marriage make their case using the slogan, love is love, and then explain why he doesn't agree. Nobody even mentioned gay marriage, and he just suddenly shouts, no, love is not love. And then he says it's inconsistent. Inconsistent with what? Is he saying that the statement love is love has a contradiction in it? Stuff like this makes me feel like these phrases were cribbed from elsewhere. Maybe in its original context this made some type of sense. Here, it just seems like a non sequitur. More importantly though, I think this unprovoked attack on gay people and their relationships is really despicable. Why did Mr. Calvo have to do this? Can't he preach the gospel without taking the opportunity to make these disrespectful statements? This was supposed to be a book about proving God's existence. Is it really necessary to say, here's why I believe in God. Oh, and by the way, fuck gay people. And this is a perfect demonstration of what is wrong with command-based morality. Someone with a moral compass based on compassion and empathy could say 2 men or 2 women can love, honor, and cherish each other the same way my wife and I do, and they deserve equal respect. That would be the most kind and decent attitude to take, and the best application of the golden rule that Christians claim to follow. But with command-based morality, there aren't reasons behind the rules. It's always just God said so. You don't really understand what you're following. You have these weird, antiquated laws in the Bible, endorsements of barbaric practices like stoning people to death. And then for some of these Christians say, oh, well, that's the Old Testament, that doesn't count. But that makes it worse. You have God tolerating stonings and infanticide and slavery for one period in history and condemning them in another. So then when we want to give equal rights to our neighbors who are gay, Christian fundamentalists say, no, that's condemned in the Bible. We can't change that. But you changed lots of other stuff. So you're picking and choosing what's right and what's wrong based on somebody's interpretation of a book from thousands of years ago. You're rejecting the morality of compassion and empathy, rejecting the doctrine of loving your neighbor like you love yourself, because you're not allowed to make moral judgments. You have to bow down to someone's interpretation of the ancient rules. I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about all Christians here. There are Christians and believers in any tradition who do apply the golden rule and support equal rights for everybody. But no matter what faith you belong to the extent that you're basing your morality on ancient laws rather than empathy and compassion, you are compromising your ability to be a truly kind and decent person. That's it for Chapter 4. As always, thanks for watching. Next time, I'll be looking at Chapters 5 and 6, all about the historical Jesus. So if you don't want to miss it, you should smash that subscribe button. Till next time.